The king comes to Ottawa. Is this a long-awaited signal that asshole Canada has arrived along with a royal entourage? Canadian incompetence leaves us vulnerable to a cyber attack. And what Golden Dome would mean for Canada and what it would cost us to join in. This is On the Line. This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Innovative Medicines Canada. With a new government in place, one thing remains clear. Canada must continue to prioritize patients and healthcare innovation. Innovative Medicines Canada is focused on collaborating with all levels of government to improve access to life-saving medicines and develop a healthcare system that prioritizes patients, ignites innovation, and drives economic growth. Canada's innovative medicine sector plays a critical role, not just in health outcomes, but in keeping us competitive on the global stage. That's why, even during a moment of political change, Innovative Medicines Canada is staying focused on the issues that matter most to Canadians. And as Canada moves forward with national pharmacare, Innovative Medicines Canada believes it's possible to expand access without limiting choice by strengthening what works and fixing what doesn't. Visit innovativemedicines.ca to learn more. Hey everybody, this will be an unusual episode of On the Line. So many news stories out there that we are actually doing 3 separate interviews today that will, in combination, make a pretty good podcast, I hope. First up, Philippe Lagacé will be here with us. He is an associate professor at Carleton University and our go-to guy on how Canadian government actually works. Then we'll be speaking with David Shipley, cybersecurity expert, on how a particularly mortifying act of Canadian incompetence left us vulnerable to a cyber attack. And then a retired Canadian general, Scott Clancy, will be here to talk about U.S. ballistic missile defense plans plus drone defense plans and what an elbows up Canada ought to do about it. We seem to want in. What's it going to cost? It's a busy episode of On the Line. Let's get to it. Well, we're talking about the news of the day, but in a weird way, we're also not, which has probably left my next guest baffled by what I mean, but it's all going to be clear in a moment. Philippe Lagacé is here, associate professor at Carleton, and personally for me, but also for the line, one of our go-to guys whenever we need to talk about constitutional issues, the way the government actually works, the monarchy. It's very confusing and weird. Like the machine doesn't work the way you think the machine would work, so we need a guy like Phil to basically fact check us and ground us sometimes. So Phil, what I wanted to talk with you about is actually bizarrely outside of your normal scope, which is why I said we're not going to necessarily be talking about just the news. The king, when you and I are recording this, is about to land in Canada. It's going to be a very brief visit. He's going to do a couple of receptions. He's going to do the speech from the throne. He's going to fly home. And I am almost not interested in that part. What I'm interested in is how, and you were talking about this on the weekend, is how this is going over in Britain. Because I don't think a lot of Canadians understand the role the king plays in our democracy. And it's become extremely apparent to me over the last 72 hours or so that a lot of Britons don't understand the role the king plays in Canadian democracy. So I'm gonna let you basically run with this here, but can I set it up this way? It looks to me like a lot of people in the UK would have really preferred the king not make this trip, because they're worried that by showing support to Canada, he might draw Donald Trump's ire onto the United Kingdom. Does that basically align with how you're seeing it?
So what I would say is the following is in both countries, both Canada and the UK, the king is used for diplomatic purposes at times. Now, almost all the time, when we use the crown for diplomatic purposes, we use the governor general. And you may see, there's the occasional National Post columnist that will point out the amount of money that we've spent on catering for the GG when they go overseas to represent Canada or whatever it is. So most of the time when we use the crown for diplomatic purposes, it's one of the vice-regals. And the United Kingdom usually gets a monopoly on using the king or for diplomatic purposes, and similarly with the rest of the royal family. And we saw that to great effect when Prime Minister Starmer went down to the White House and presented President Trump with a handwritten invitation from His Majesty inviting the president for a second state visit. Now, as Prime Minister Carney has pointed out, that didn't sit very well with us, not the least of which because the UK, uh, since really January, has not exactly been very friendly towards Canada. I won't go as far as to say that, but certainly not what we might have expected in terms of a stalwart ally, right? Somebody standing by us. The UK has understandably gone out of its way to emphasize the special relationship it has with the United States and not tried to get Canada to muddy that picture. And your listeners may recall that even during the press conference that Starmer had with President Trump, when a question came up about Canada, that was quashed like right away. So what's occurred is in inviting the king to give the throne speech in Canada, we've kind of complicated that neat package that the UK government tried to present to the US. We're now using the king for our own purposes, and that is complexifying how the UK is trying to use the king. And I'll just end by saying this is kind of highlighting one of the challenges that doesn't typically arise when it comes to the personal union that we have with the UK, but it's showing how that does lead to some tensions at times.
The funny thing is, I understand the British perspective exactly. And Jen and I have both been we're using the very colorful and cheerful term, asshole Canada. We want this country to actually assert its own self-interest and its national interests, which probably starts with identifying what those are or even thinking, do we have them? The British are better at that than we are. And the British very quickly realized, whoops, okay, we've got Donald Trump back. He's even weirder than he was last time. And we have to very carefully guard British interests. And I think Canada was thinking, hey, we were there in the Battle of Britain. Like, where's our help here? Carney inviting the king and the king accepting the invite, to me, is not just Canada using its constitutional monarchy. It's also kind of a delightful little FU to some of the people in the UK. I'm not saying we did it for that reason. I'm just kind of saying it's really nice that it had the fringe benefit of we got to basically show them up and go, look, if you don't want to play ball with us, we're just going to call up our king.
No, I think to your point, like the UK maybe over-indexed a little bit on the special relationship with the US, and understandably, Starmer is also trying to recalibrate the relationship between the UK and the EU post-Brexit. So he spent a lot of time on that, and we felt a little bit, like on the outside. And this is long-standing, as your listeners and you know very well, Matt. AUKUS would be another kind of case in point of that, right? Where the UK working now with Australia and the US on a nuclear subdeal, and we're kind of sitting there with the Kiwis going, "What about us? What happened to us?" So I think for some time now, Canada has been trying to make sure that the Five Eyes kind of stays as a true Five Eyes and things of that nature. And we've been seeing the UK really move very much, as you're saying, in its interests. And as a number of people will point out, in the Canadian mind, the fact that we were with the UK as their kind of main ally after the fall of France in the Second World War, that still rings very true to us. That's still kind of close to our history and how we understand our role in the world. But the world has moved on, right? Like that's just, they no longer see us in those terms. They're like, that was a past generation. Where have you been lately? And Canada really hasn't done much to pull its weight in these circles. But to your point, I think the UK was maybe a bit surprised when we said, all right, well, it's also our king, and we want to demonstrate our sovereignty. And we're not going to stand idly by if the UK or if the King of the United Kingdom either receives the president before he comes to Canada or goes to the US before he comes to Canada. So we're going to make sure that the King of Canada visits Canada at the top of the agenda. And then not only that, but he's going to open our 45th Parliament. And I think the UK maybe wasn't expecting that because they were expecting us to kind of stick to our tried and true practice of emphasizing the GG.
I'm wondering, and I don't know if there's any way for you and I to know this. So I literally am just spitballing here, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are. The British guard the king jealously, and I think with good reason. They use him as kind of the secret weapon when needed. And also the fact, and I'm not here to do any tabloid trash, but let's face it, the king is not well. Like he is battling a serious disease at an advanced age. I would understand why even his closest handlers, whatever their affection may be for Canada, might not have wanted him to make a transoceanic trip to read a speech and do a dinner. And I'm honestly wondering what, if anything, you read into the fact that the king said yes. Because I would imagine his medical staff, probably his palace staff, and certainly the British government probably were finding all kinds of reasons, valid or otherwise, to tell him to send his regrets to the Canadians. But he's coming. And the king has also made other gestures, including a meeting with Prime Minister Carney overseas and showing up in public in Britain in Canadian military uniform. This is not stuff that most Canadians or even Britons might notice, but that's a signal the king is sending here. And I just thought that was really interesting. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for him to take a pass on this. He's flying across the ocean for 20 hours in the middle of fighting cancer. That's a thing.
Absolutely, it is. So, to your point, when some of us first started musing about inviting the king to Canada around January, February, when all this rhetoric of the 51st state was coming out, a number of people kind of responded saying, well, look, I mean, the king's really not well. He wouldn't be able to make it. You know, he has to put his health first. And this helps explain as well why he hadn't come to Canada since his coronation. I mean, he made the trip to Australia, but he hadn't come to Canada yet. But to your point, the UK government, the palace, could have come up with all sorts of reasons why he couldn't make the trip. But like his mother, I think he takes his role as King of Canada seriously. And when he had an audience with his Canadian Prime Minister, and his Canadian Prime Minister invited him to open Parliament, I think he saw that as core to his role as King of Canada, and something that he definitely wanted to do. And again, his mother was the same when it came to this kind of relationship between her role as head of the United Kingdom and her role as head of the other realms. A similar thing happened in 1973 in the Canadian context, when she chose to attend a meeting that the British government didn't want her to attend. And she said, I'm going to attend on the advice of my Canadian government. So this is one of these really interesting things where the king or the monarch in the UK, even though they have to follow advice, because they get advice from different realms, they can sometimes do what they want based on the advice of another realm. And that's what we're seeing here. So the king, the fact that he's coming, probably against the preferences of the UK government, probably against the preferences of his counselors at the palace, is making a point. He is demonstrating that he takes his role as head of state in Canada seriously. And as importantly, I think he really genuinely thinks that this is an important time for him to make a point about Canadian sovereignty.
I want to ask you a question. It's kind of more of a procedural question, but these are the kinds of things we turn to you for. How demanding could Canada get of His Majesty's attention? And obviously there's protocol and we wouldn't want to make it awkward. But if the king had been hesitating, humming, hawing, how forceful could we get? Like, and I'm just honestly wondering, because obviously there's etiquette and diplomatic courtesy and all that stuff. But what are our rights to the king's attention, if any?
So this is one of these realms where a lot of it kind of falls around custom.
Yeah.
Both in the UK and in Canada, it's understood that you don't put the sovereign in an uncomfortable position. You don't expose them to too much political controversy. And you're very careful with putting them in contexts where they would become a target, or they would, become, the source of any kind of tension, particularly within political factions within your country, but internationally as well. And so the way this happens in the UK, for instance, is whenever there's advice going from the cabinet office to the palace, from the prime minister to the king, the palace and the cabinet office coordinate first. You make sure that whatever advice is coming from the British government to the king you already know what the answer is going to be ahead of time, right? Because the palace and the cabinet office has kind of cleared this to make sure that there's not going to be any surprises. A similar thing would happen in the Canadian context, where the Privy Council office would be in touch with the palace and say, look, this is what we want. This is what we are hoping to get out of this. What's the response going to be? And the palace would come back and say, here's what the response is going to be. And they'd find a way to square that circle. And adding to this, in this context, you can be sure that the UK Cabinet Office was also trying to get its point of view in those discussions too. And we've heard, this is not coming out in the media, that the UK government was trying to make sure that even the speech from the throne in Canada probably shouldn't contain anything that would really damage the UK's diplomatic efforts with the United States. But to your point, when you really want to proffer big A advice, so that constitutionally binding advice, you can. And refusal of big A advice would be a constitutional crisis. So everybody's kind of aware that that ultimately belongs with the king's cabinets. And you really don't want to get to a situation where the monarch is forced to pick between two sets of big A advice from different governments. So everybody has an interest not to get there. But if you want to be asshole Canada has the option of big A advice.
That's exactly what I was thinking. And I don't know where we lay this. I don't know if this is to the credit of Mark Carney or his advisors or the Privy Council, as you said. But you know me, man. I don't often walk around telling people how impressed I am by Canadian governance, but I am impressed by this. I know enough to know that this was not as easy as it would look. And we had to insist on this, and probably in a way that we are not used to asserting ourselves. And I would really like to think this will be the start of a trend, not necessarily with His Majesty, but in general, of Canada going, we have interests and we will defend them.
I fully agree with you. I think in a different context, and even with a different prime minister, I'm not sure that this would have happened the way that it did.
Yeah.
I think there's also a personal connection here between the prime minister and the king. The prime minister was governor of the Bank of England. He would have met the monarch on a number of occasions. As well, the prime minister's brother works for Prince William. So, there's a lot of personal connections there. And, whenever you're studying institutions, you still have to always bear in mind that the human element is key. And I think that personal connection gave the prime minister a good deal of comfort in being assertive here. I mean, I think he's an assertive guy to begin with. But I suspect even within the naysayers that there probably would have been within the Canadian government. I'm thinking, there's lots of bureaucrats around this town who are like, well, we should emphasize the governor general more than anything else. We shouldn't be emphasizing the king. It's not really our thing anymore. This is outdated. We shouldn't have the king opening parliament. I think this prime minister came in and said, nuts to that. This is what we're doing. And this is how we're doing it. And you can imagine the conversations they would have had as well of people saying, well, you won a lot of seats in Quebec. You don't want to upset the Quebecers. And he probably said, we're doing it anyway. So, to your point, if he can take that same energy and apply it to a lot of other Canada's national interests, it's a good sign.
One more question for you here, and it's aimed directly at you and your role as an academic. How are you going to teach this? Because this is really, really interesting. This is interesting for me. It's got to be 10 times more interesting for you. How does this get folded into the classroom?
So it's funny. I always start my Canadian Government 101 class with the crown. Yeah. And I show a diagram on the PowerPoint presentation saying, the crown is the Canadian state, and the legal personality of Canada is His Majesty right in Canada. So anybody who's ever signed a contract with the federal government knows this. You're signing a contract with a fake person, legal person called His Majesty and right of Canada. But that legal personality has an embodiment, does have a natural capacity, which is this person who's coming to give the throne speech. And now, in years past, my students' eyes would have glazed over. And, it was a running joke. Oh, here goes Lagasse again with his crown. Well, what a weirdo. Why does he keep talking about this? Like, nobody cares, man. Like, get with the times. Well, now as the academic, I can say when I start my classes now for the rest of my career, I think I'll be able to say, look, you all lived at this moment when this was significant and it actually did matter. And it may not happen all the time, and it maybe only happens every 45, 50 years. But when it happens, and it's important, and it demonstrates why this institution still matters and why it's still central to the Canadian state.
It's interesting. I'll let you go after this, Phil, but I've got a son who's 10 and a daughter who's 12 who have, I would imagine, predictable levels of interest in Canadian constitutional order and governance. But during the pandemic, when the Queen gave her speech, they listened. And when they heard the King was coming, they were interested. They couldn't care less about Parliament, but the King coming was interesting to them. And this is something that Jen has made this point many, many times, that there is something about the monarchy as an institution, and the monarchy is very good at leaning into it. But there's something about people that the monarchy has figured out. The King showing up, I think, is fantastic. And I'm not a passionate monarchist, but I think just it is a brilliant strategic move. And the fact that we were able to pull this off, I'm giddy. I don't do giddy.
There's a classic work that is still kind of the cornerstone of how we understand modern constitutional monarchy, Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution. And Bagehot makes the point that the crown is the dignified part of the Constitution, whereas the government is the efficient part.
Yeah.
And what he says in that, what's the role of the dignified part? It's the one that appeals to your emotion. It's the one that appeals to, that part of the polity, that part of the populace that needs something to have an emotional connection to, not simply, a mechanical one. And we see it in presidential republics, right? Like I was just in Paris last week. The gold, the honor guard, the military parades, whatever it is, we need something as humans that draws on our emotional attachment to our institutions. And the monarchy, as Bagehot pointed out in 1867, the year Canada was confederated, it provides that in our system. And we don't often see it, but this is a perfect case, as you're pointing out, of, you know what, if the monarchy, if having the king come here, again, once in like 50 years, gets people interested in the institution, they want to know why it's happening, they want to know more about it, maybe it'll actually lead more Canadians to actually watch a throne speech. Like, could you imagine? Like, that is an inherently good thing, and it tells us something about why monarchy endures and why it still has a place in a modern democratic system.
Almost 158 years after we federated this weird country, the king's coming because we planned ahead.
The king is coming to a capital that Queen Victoria picked. Yeah, I mean, it's for all the people who say that Canada has moved on from this institution, I would simply point to the fact that it still runs deep in our institutional structures. And whether or not people are ambivalent about it or not, it is still a potent symbol of Canadian sovereignty.
My kids barely know who the prime minister is. They would happily wave a little Canadian flag if the king drove by. So there you go. Something just primal about it. Phil, thanks for this, man. Great to have you on. Appreciate the time. And we're recording this on Monday, just as the king's about to arrive. So enjoy the festivities tomorrow.
Thanks, Matt.
Take care.
Bye.
Philippe Lagasse from Carleton University, associate professor and our go-to expert on constitutional matters, and a much snappier dresser than I am, but he's a handsome man. David Shipley, CEO and co-founder of Beauceron Security, a Canadian cybersecurity company. He's been one of my go-tos on cybersecurity matters for a long time. He is one of the only people who has stared into the abyss as long as I have, and believe me, it has stared back into him. So, David, you and I have joked over the years, although I'm not sure we're joking anymore, that we probably, with hindsight, should not have built an entire civilization on top of a couple of lines of like 1970s vintage code. But we did. And rather than design the internet and our entire economy organically, kind of with the sense of how do we optimize this to be like customer friendly and user friendly, but also secure and resilient, we sort of just kept like layering patch updates onto software that was originally issued on like bendable floppy disks. And millions of lives now depend on these systems. And one of the things I've been careful over the years, David, to not say aloud some of the things you and I have talked about privately, because I don't want to put bad stuff out there. But in a private conversation you and I would have had a couple of years ago, we talked about how one of the little appreciated Achilles heels of modern Western countries is the food distribution system, because it is spectacularly vulnerable to tampering. It is the ultimate just in time delivery because food is a highly perishable good. You have a very limited window of opportunity from when a food is harvested in any way, like an animal is slaughtered or a piece of fruit is picked or an egg is retrieved from the hen house. Like there's a very limited amount of time where that has to go from wherever in the world it was collected to my table. And any delay can be a real problem there. You and I had talked 2 years ago, offline, off the record, about how an attack on the food distributions network of any country should be viewed as similar to an attack on a power distribution grid, a communications grid, a medical system. What has been happening in the United Kingdom? I'm going to let you do the explaining here. Tell me what's been happening in the UK over the last month.
So since mid-April, we've had a rolling series of hits on major parts of the UK food chain, retail chain, and so notably, you had Marks and Spencers, which for Canadian listeners is roughly about the same size as Empire Co. is in Canada in terms of revenue. It's about 5% of the overall grocery market, but is a significant player. Hit with a ransomware attack, and started with turning off things like your click and order and then your online payments. And then it sort of rolled up into now their shelves were empty. So IT systems were crippled. And there's some interesting interviews with the CEO who said, like when this first started happening, I was in shock. And they were not prepared for this. They did not have the plans. They saw their world as we sell goods, we sell groceries. They didn't see themselves as critical infrastructure. A couple of days after the Marks and Spencer hit, then you have the Co-op Group there, which is another major retail grocery convenience store chain. It gets hit. Now, what's fascinating about what happens to it is they see the attackers working in real time and they decide to scuttle the ship before they can actually execute. So they shut themselves down, which led hilariously to the attackers claiming, well, you guys just made this 10 times worse than what we would have did. Probably not. They probably did the right thing in all good humor. But so you had two major retail chains. And then just about a week or two ago, on top of this ongoing weeks-long chaos for these retailers, another food distributor called Peter Green Chilled gets hit. Now, Peter Green Chilled supplies meat and other perishable products, refrigerated, to not just Marks and Spencers and Co-op, but Sainsbury's, Tesco, all the chains are now rolled into this. And so, picture these British newspapers, and they've got constant coverage of these empty shelves weeks after the event. And it's not just the UK. In Germany, there's been hits against the dairy supply and others. And what's absolutely fascinating is that the group largely believed to be behind this is a loosely affiliated group of mostly teenage males, English-speaking teenage males, who are using software developed by most likely a Russian-based group. I say most likely because the cyber intelligence world is a lot like the intelligence world. We don't like to just state absolute facts, apparently, even though they promote themselves in a Russian-speaking forum. They tell your affiliates you can't attack Commonwealth of Independent States, so those following, former Soviet Union, Russia, etc. And another group has accused them of working with the FSB, but high probability they are Russian. This is the dystopia that we're in. And the interesting thing is Canada was the first canary of the coal mine of this 2 years ago, but nobody listened.
So one of there's a lot to respond to there, David, but one of the things that jumps out at me right away is modern companies often do not have a good understanding of what they are. They think about what they used to be. So a Marks and Spencer would think of itself as being a brick and mortar retail outlet. That's their culture, that's their history, and that's their mindset. What they actually are is an inventory management and fleet logistics company that operates a chain of warehouses. The brick and mortar retail operation at this point is almost an afterthought. And if anything scrambles the back end for the fleet logistics of the trucks and the vans that move all this stuff around, but also just the inventory management, you can easily starve in a country that has tons of food if no one knows where it is in the warehouse. And this is the kind of thing that worries me. So what we look to have here, to your point, is a bunch of teenagers having a laugh. I'm assuming there was a ransom demand at some point. This is an incredible signal of vulnerability, though, because if I was a hostile country and I want to cause problems for an enemy, but I don't want to get into a kinetic shooting war with them, scrambling their grocery store IT is a pretty good way to do that. I think eventually we would figure it out, but we would have 7 to 10 days of wondering if we were going to starve to death, which would be a hell of an opportunity for an adversary country to, cause some trouble abroad while we would be distracted.
Absolutely. And if you think, a longer term in election cycles versus headlines, okay, well, what would be the game of causing this much disruption in the retail food chain in the UK? You want to topple a deeply already unpopular Labour government and reinstall a conservative bent that might be more friendly to Russia? Piss people off the grocery store in already difficult cost of living times in the UK. This is what foreign influence 3.0 can look like. It doesn't have to be just the AI deepfakes out there. It can be screwing with people's lives in such a way that is so gray and so many layers of plausible deniability that it's perfect. Or, the alternative is that just a side benefit, and this is just a way to generate cash back into your economy to fund the war in Ukraine. If you're North Korea, to fund your nuclear missile program, maybe refloating a destroyer based on the latest things that have happened there. So, this also causes instability. This is no-win scenario, no matter which way I slice this. And the collective response continues to be meh.
You've written an article for The Line. By the time this podcast goes live, there's a pretty good chance that article will be live. And one of the things you included in that article was something that made me laugh, but also made me very sad. And it was that we spent 2 years developing a package of initiatives and a piece of legislation to overhaul and augment our cyber defenses, but due to a clerical error in Parliament, we accidentally invalidated the law. And the Senate caught it and they sent it back to the House to fix it. But then Justin Trudeau resigned and prorogued Parliament and the legislation died. Now, I know there are procedural mechanisms where the government can resurrect legislation that was lost due to proroguements and things like that. But it just seems a little on the nose when you live in a country that does not take defense at all seriously, but particularly cyber defense, to have one of our major allies having its food distribution network directly targeted, knowing for a fact that similar attacks have happened in this country, and knowing for a fact that we took that seriously enough to spend 2 years writing up a piece of legislation that, due to human error, was null as soon as it was passed. It's just, you couldn't make that up. Like, if you put that in a show like Veep, people would not find it plausible. You put it in the newspaper in Canada, people don't even notice.
Yeah, and it's particularly painful for me, Matt, because I spent 2.5 years working behind the scenes, not for any direct benefit of my company, but because it's what I believe was essential. And the thing that you need to understand is that I was so dogged in getting this legislation. It wasn't perfect, but I was so dogged and determined to get it done because it just covered the bare basics. And my hope was, if we could get the basics done, we could talk about the food supply. We could talk about healthcare. But this law would have protected telecommunications, banking, energy transmission. And that's really important, not energy generation or intra-province distribution. Mm-hmm. And everyone should be scared about that. I'll get back to that in a second. And transportation. So ports. your airlines. Like if you're thinking, can our airlines get any worse? Yeah, they can if they're absolutely crippled with a cyber attack, and they are not required to do a damn thing to prevent that. And so, this law was a baby step. And it was a baby step that was years behind Europe, years behind Australia, years behind the United States, although hilariously, the United States national cyber is imploding in all kinds of bad ways for us. So a talk for another day. But this was just, okay, what's even in your mandate to deal with? And, they were very clear. We're only going to do the stuff that it's crystal clear this is ours to run and deal with, because I don't know. Constitutions, by the way, weren't meant to be suicide pacts, but whatever. The provinces are responsible, which is code for nothing is going to happen. And so that failed. It failed spectacularly. I see no evidence from the one single 800-word ministerial letter. Look how efficient we are, how coordinated we are. Cyber doesn't even get one word of the 800, which makes me deeply concerned that we're not there. And even on the campaign trail, even what we've heard the throne speech, boy, we're going to go after that online hate again. Great. See how this plays out. Could you keep the lights on?
No, they couldn't. And one of the things I wonder about is one of the problems we have is demographic or cultural or whatever you want to call it. But so many of us grew up in an era before the internet was ubiquitous that we still have this thought in the back of our mind that if the internet were taken down for 5 to 10 days, well, it would just be like back in the 90s. We'd read a book. We'd go for a bike ride. And we don't understand that all of the back-end infrastructure systems that run our society are now even more dependent on this thing than people imagine, all in the name of efficiency. We have optimized ourselves to a place of astonishing vulnerability. And we spent 2 years coming up with a bare bones plan to begin to address some of that. And oopsie, it was nuked by clerical error.
Well, first, one of the things that no one has studied, even if we just lost the internet for the day, just like we couldn't check our email, etc. Do you know why we didn't close liquor stores at the start of the pandemic? Because people were requiring access to that because they sometimes had addictions. And if you cut someone alcoholic off from that, you actually can kill more people. And so it was a vital public service. And I mean, notwithstanding my humor around the rest of us needing a coping mechanism, which is also sadly very true in many respects. But nobody has ever studied what happens if you cut a country off that's addicted to the dopamine hit of constant digital connection and information. How long till we crack? 1 day? 2 days? I mean, the Rogers outage, people were losing their minds, to quote Heath Ledger's The Dark Knight Returns. Like, do it for a week and see what our addled brains handle. But notwithstanding the fact that we'd run out of food, that all kinds of bad things happen. And what's interesting is your point about fragility, and I think about this a lot. The power outage in Spain and Portugal was a warning. Highly driven, renewable, climate change friendly energy grids require a level of information technology coordination unheard of previously. They're enormously fragile. And so unless you can quickly compensate, and you need IT to do that, this all falls apart. That means each province is regulating. And in the midst of this, we have Nova Scotia Power's breach, which thank God it was just the crimes, and they just stole every NS Power person's deeply important financial information. Yay.
Can you slow down? Can you actually just take 1 minute? I was about to ask you about this. Give me the 1 minute précis of what you're talking about here. I read this story, but I didn't get all the context. What happened in Nova Scotia?
Nova Scotia Power got hit with a ransomware gang. It was one of the identified ransomware gangs, because in their fascinating update on Friday, they said it was a ransom. We didn't pay. We listened to advice from the cops plus sanctions, which is a huge clue, right? We might have paid, but, sanctions. Interesting. So probably Russia. They got away with customer information, crippled online portals, payments, usage tracking, etc., crippled internal business systems, so HR, payroll, overtime, etc. Standard business operation ransomware shenanigans. Did not hit the operational, the actual power plants, etc. But this is the largest Canadian utility hit so far. And by the way, for those listening, I am typically Disaster Dave, Prophet of Doom, when it comes to all things cyber. I was screaming from the rooftops that what happened in Newfoundland was going to get replicated, and it did, crippling multiple hospitals in Ontario years later because not a damn thing was learned. This is coming to a power utility near you, and your provincial energy regulator is either probably not paying attention to it, more concerned with ratepayer friction because they're political appointees than making sure the lights stay on. The incentives are not aligned. And so it is a fascinating warning that will likely get the same collective shrug. But at least I can say you were warned.
Yeah. And, just purely to put a bow on this, David, and kind of to end where we began just this morning, before you and I recorded this, I checked the websites of the British supermarket chains that we started talking about. All of them are starting to resume some operations. Co-op in particular, the ones who shut their own systems down before the hackers got into it, they seem to have been able to get back on their feet faster, and they're thinking they'll be back to largely normal operations this week. Marks and Spencer is not expecting to return to normal operations before July. And Britain is lucky that there was enough resiliency in their food distribution system, enough grocery store options that people can, there's shelves are empty here, but maybe the Tesco down the street is still stocked. This is a group of teenagers that pulled this off, a nation state that made a run at 3 or 4 different elements of critical infrastructure at the same time could cause chaos. And in Canada, we would have the Senate going, hey, there's a typo in this legislation that invalidates it all. Okay. Like you said, man, they were warned. I've done my part. You've done your part. What else can we do?
But it's even worse, right? Like we've got this constitutional navel gazing. Well, that's not a federal responsibility. Cool. Do you know who doesn't care about federal provincial responsibility division?
The Russians?
Russia.
Yeah. As you and I are sitting around the campfire, eating our squirrel stew, we'll have a great talk about why it's okay. This wasn't in federal jurisdiction.
Yeah, nine meals runway, and we're like, but the charter.
Yeah. 9 missed meals from anarchy. Yep. David Shipley, CEO, co-founder, Beauceron Security. As uplifting as always, man. Thanks for coming on.
You're always welcome.
Scott Clancy, my guest right now, our Major General, retired Royal Canadian Air Force. He was, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, Deputy Director of Operations at NORAD. Did I get that?
Director of Operations.
Director of Operations. Okay, this is why I asked. Currently a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and a guy who I was thinking about last week. Over the years, I've had the chance to interview Scott a couple of times, probably more than that now, actually. And we were usually talking about North American missile defense or air defense, as befits the former Director of Operations at NORAD. All of a sudden, that went from an issue that, Scott, I say this with affection, but mostly nerds were talking about. All of a sudden, it was front page news because the president has been talking about Golden Dome, and Canada is apparently considering joining it. So I want to ask you a very basic question. We can get into some of the more fun stuff in a minute. But to your understanding, what would Golden Dome look like? If the U.S. actually goes ahead with this, if it works, what would it be?
So I don't think even the president of the United States or the people that he's pinging on with his initial executive order back when he took over the presidency, or even now, have a really, really good sense of what it'll look like at end state. And I think that's important because there's a lot of talk about, space-based weapons and space-based systems. And okay, it's what we have now, moving towards what we think of the future. And the vision that has inspired the Golden Dome is the Iron Dome, which is actually 3.5 to 4 systems in the Israeli Defense Force architecture that protects them from integrated air and missile threats across the Middle Eastern region. Now, what that means is that what you have in Canada now, which is for the most part, trying to shoot down missiles with airplanes, so cruise missiles with airplanes, and a limited ballistic missile defense capability that is focused on the threat from North Korea, uniquely focused on the threat from North Korea, which means that nobody really knows exactly how that's going to play over the future, but we know some of the fundamental pieces. So you ask a fantastic question, Matt, because even when I was a director of operations for NORAD, we were trying to develop a defensive system that would start to defend some of those key elements around North America. For the longest time, and when Canada did not become signatory to the ballistic missile defense stuff back in the 2000s, late 1990s and 2000s, it was based upon two reasons. First one was conceptually, most of the thinking was that that might detract from the concept of mutually assured destruction. The idea being is that if you have a defensive system from nuclear ballistic missiles, that makes nuclear war that much more probable because then you can use them because it's not a catastrophic cost. Okay. The second one was because it was unproven technology. Two things have changed. One, the conventional threat from drones, conventional cruise missiles, conventional ballistic missiles, all of it, aircraft, subversion, all of these have changed since the early 2000s, and the technology has become much more viable. The problem with applying the Israeli idea in North America is one of pure geography and the vastness of geography. As we say in NORAD, if you're protecting everything, you're protecting nothing. And the reality is you can't defend the entire continent. It's just too huge. And if a cruise missile conventional goes off in the middle of Hudson's Bay, nobody really cares, right? Like it's not going to change anything significantly. So you have to decide first what is most dear to you, what is key and crucial to the survival of your nation and your economies, and you protect that first. So we had already started to develop the sensors and the target acquisition to be able to do this. That's what's going to look like first. Defend key specific areas, create small domes if you want, of integrated, layered with, aircraft and things like that over top of it, but it's not going to be all encompassing as you grow to a more dome-like system. So that's what I think it's going to look like in a short term, evolving to a more space-based, integral, complete system in the long term.
Golden bubbles doesn't sound as cool. It actually sounds kind of ridiculous, but that's really what we would be talking about here. You would have bubbles over critical railheads or large urban areas, nuclear power plants, and vast tracts of North America would probably not be protected because, as you say, if somebody fires a cruise missile into a farmer's field, that sucks for the farmer. The rest of us are fine. One of the things I find interesting, and you mentioned kind of the ballistic missile threat, we had this weird period of history where all the superpowers basically had a gun to each other's head, and we still have that. We can destroy each other's civilizations in about 45 minutes if we choose to. Mm-hmm. But what I'm more worried about these days is not the guy who's got 1,000 nuclear warheads loaded onto ICBMs. I'm more worried about the guy who's got a few hundred drones with fairly small explosive packages, power equivalent to a stick of dynamite or a hand grenade, a little bit of software and a little bit of ingenuity. And I'm not convinced you couldn't shut down our civilization if you knew which things to hit. What can you do with a few hundred drones taking out hydro transformer stations?
Well, here we go. And the swarm drone or drone threat was something that, back in 2018 and 2020, when I was either in Alaska or in Colorado Springs, we significantly looked at the drone threat as being the preeminent, not because of the catastrophic nature of what it could necessarily do, because you're still limited in there. The more you get larger explosives, the more that you become, a threat that you can see and deal with, either in terms of, you producing that capability as well as us seeing and being able to defend against it. But the idea that you could achieve a significant effect with a swarm of a bunch of things, into either a single target or into, multiple targets. So yes, this is why the term integrated air and missile defense is really what the Golden Dome is all about. It's not just about, pick one threat. If NORAD was trying to defend against the aircraft of 9/11 alone, then you'd be ignoring the fact that, someone with a container ship off the coast of the United States with a rigged ballistic missile kind of thing that could get maybe, even 100 kilometers, could do significant damage, regardless of what the type of warhead is on board it. You have to look at all the threats. And that's why you focus specifically and you start with those places that you're going to defend significantly. Funny enough, if you start drawing the crosses of those things that you want to defend, geographically, they start to get into the same areas, right? And so when you set up a defense of a specific area, you realize that, well, if I defend this center point, I actually get, 45 of the most highest value targets that I really want to defend. And that's just a discussion of where you want to be. So you're absolutely right. Drones is a significant thing. And that means that it's not just kinetic defeat, right? There's control of the electromagnetic spectrum in here. There's jamming capabilities. There's things with directed energy weapons. And then there's just being aware. But you need to still have domain awareness with sensors and things like this to perceive the threat. And you need to work backwards from there into the target acquisition realm.
A couple of years ago, I was at an event, large public event, with high value targets. And I saw some of the security guys setting up, and I gave them a nod and a wave, and they were, very polite, in a good mood. They're just working a job. One of them had a device I had never seen before, and it looked like something crossed between a rifle and a leaf blower.
Yeah.
It was a drone jammer.
Yeah.
And I had never seen one of those deployed in the field before, but basically, if he got the call that there was an overhead threat, he could aim that thing at the drone. And if it didn't short it out, it would probably jam its ability to receive radio control and presumably crash the thing, which would suck for whoever it landed on. But it would be a hell of a lot better than having that thing do a controlled flight into a political VIP. I was saying to my colleague Jen Gerson recently, Scott, that every time I see China putting on one of these drone shows over their cities where they create these absolutely spectacular and gorgeous light shows of dragons and dolphins in the sky, I'm thinking to myself, this is beautiful. It's breathtaking. It is a massive demonstration of human ingenuity. And that thing could destroy any fleet at anchor or an airfield's worth of aircraft if they knew what they were doing with it.
Absolutely. Right. And so drone jammers, we can nerd out with the geekiness on a lot of this stuff very quickly, but you jam the signal between the drone and its control station. That's one thing. But if you have an AI smart drone that's been given a preloaded, route to follow and to do something, you could jam that thing all in the world. If you're not going to defeat it electromagnetically, then you're not going to defeat it. And those are two different things. We start with, hey, I want to interdict the control mechanism, but the evolution of drones is moving so fast beyond this. And this is technology, and this is part of this innovation thing. This is technology that is moving so quickly that keeping ahead of that is not, the job of McDonnell Douglas and big defense contractors. It's the job of anybody, and the smartest people with AI and tech. Go ask the Ukrainians why they're rejecting most of the American major companies, OEMs and SEMs that are SMEs that are producing drones, because they need the technology tomorrow. They need the advances. They need numbers, and they're not willing to wait for, we'll harden. Stop. I don't need it hardened from this and this and this. I need to do this, and I need to do it tomorrow. And give me 1,000 of them.
I remember talking a couple of years ago. I'm glad you mentioned, Scott, Ukraine, because just the last couple of days, we're recording this just for the listeners, the viewers know this. We're recording this on a Monday. And between Friday and Sunday, the Russians have been just lighting up Kyiv. Some of the largest air attacks on Kyiv that we've seen since the war began. Significant civilian casualties, significant infrastructure damage, but also, I think, Scott, just the psychological effect of the city at night burning. Just these huge plumes of smoke in the air. And I was thinking about talking with, I can't name him because he's currently serving with the Canadian Armed Forces, but I was talking to one of the guys who's thinking about kind of next generation technologies, particularly for the brigade we have in Latvia. How do we protect it from threats overhead? And he said to me, drones are so interesting because you have to destroy a lot of very small targets quickly. And he said, it's either going to be something like an incredibly high-powered Star Trek or Star Wars style laser cannon, or it's going to be shotguns in some sort of like rotary barrel arrangement, like a Gatling gun 12 gauge that you park on top of a vehicle, you put a radar on it, and you basically, when you say weapons free, that thing will just wipe out anything that's moving quickly through the sky, which could suck for the local migratory bird population, but it could keep a ground force from being destroyed. And I remember just thinking about this, like the Canadian Armed Forces in particular, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, often works on a multi-decadal procurement cycle. The Americans are a bit better than us. It might be a decade. Most of the allies are somewhere in that range as well. We will be ready in 10 to 15 years to defeat technology that the Ukrainians would already consider obsolete.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I don't know what we do about that.
Well, okay, so here we go. You're talking about the clash of civilizations, right? A little bit in Canada, where you have governmental policy that is focused on free, fair competition of a society that doesn't move and doesn't perceive significant threats over time. And there's been a lot said. I mean, there's an ex-fighter pilot that is now the Deputy Minister of Procurement looking at how to modernize the procurement policy of the Canadian Armed Forces. I applaud all of these initiatives. Figure out what's right, figure out how to do it in a month, let the contract in a week, and start delivering within 6 months. That's it. You can't do that with the hoops that have to go through Treasury Board and the acquisitions, because it'll bog down in the courts. If there's no way, this is why I dislike, serving, and I was never an acquisition guy, but the programmatic surrounding having to get through the free and fair competition pieces are preventing the military from getting the tools that it needs in a timely fashion with technology that can be adaptive. Now, the best way to do this, Matt, is going to be to procure open architecture systems and allow them to morph. So imagine if you said, here's our integrated air and missile defense short-range system. It's going to be that system for the next 40 years. By the way, the subcomponents of that will shift and change. Much like the F-35 is an open architecture Gen 5 aircraft, it could shift and change either the hardware or the software on board to be adaptive to that situation for decades, so that you can change those. But you'd have to be able to react within that, as opposed to having to go back to Parliament for more money and an updated contract. So where have we achieved success in our defense procurement? Is the Chinook procurement a success? Well, it was the fastest delivered procurement. Why? Because it was single sourced. Why? Because no other aircraft actually fits the requirement for that, right? So we single sourced it. But where we single sourced it, we achieve it on time, and it's able to deliver real capability for the force in short order. So just do that. This is where we have to get away from, well, right looks like it has to be fair and every single defense dollar and. But this is going to be the problem with Prime Minister Carney's budget. And this is why I'm happy that he's delayed it into the fall. Because you could modernize that defense acquisition thing until you're blue in the face. But if you don't solve the fundamental problem about how you're actually going to pay for the systems to get there, it doesn't really matter. And he's only got really 3 choices with the kind of spending that he would have to do to get there. He's either going to have to significantly raise taxes on the Canadian population, sales and income, significantly. He's going to have to decrease and cut drastically the transfer payments to the provinces, which is going to have a direct impact on healthcare, education, and housing. Or he's going to have to put the country more deeply into debt. Those are the only 3 options he has, not just to meet 2%, but the 3.5 or 5% that is going to be the target once the NATO conference finishes here in the summer.
I'm thinking about the American economist who came up with what he called Stein's law, which very simply said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And guys like you and me, and obviously in different career paths, but trying to get the same message out there, trying to tell people that Canada had this incredible run after the Second World War, but it wasn't going to go on forever. Reality was going to come back eventually. And unfortunately, we have optimized ourselves for a non-reality based existence, and reality always wins in the end. Talking about the decision-making process, look, the annals of Canadian military procurement abound with cautionary tales. There's no there, I think that was ungrammatical, but I think people understand the point I was making there. One of my favorites in recent years, and I was asked about this by a representative from an allied government, is after the invasion of Ukraine, Canada, the Justin Trudeau cabinet realized very quickly that we needed the ability to produce more artillery ammunition in Canada. And we had some capability to do that already. It wasn't going from 0 to 100. It was scaling up what we already had. And that required some targeted investments. The industry was reluctant to do that because their attitude is we don't want to spend massive money on our machine plant and it's cynical, but I get where they're coming from. They're like, the war could end tomorrow and we'd be embarking on a multi-year expansion process. We want federal backstops. And I think the feds realized very quickly that that was necessary, that the amount of money was by federal spending standards relatively modest. And that approval order still took 2 years to come because that's just the speed of the Canadian cabinet, particularly on defense matters. You talked a minute ago about having sort of living open architecture systems, where you buy a weapon system, but you buy it on the understanding that every year it's going to be updated. It's going to get a software update. It's going to get a hardware update. They're going to swap in this radar for that radar, things like that. I'm glad you mentioned software because I think we need to start thinking of our military as software that we patch regularly. Rather than being like every once in a generation, we're going to buy a fleet of the thing and then we're going to run with it for a generation. We're going to buy things and we're going to patch it every year. And eventually they're going to wear out physically and they'll need to be replaced, but it's going to be an incremental process. You've probably heard the term, but people have been talking about war as consumables rather than as systems, where the Ukrainians don't look at drones as a system. They look at it as a bullet. It's the difference between a rifle and a bullet, right? The Ukrainians are firing drones every day, and then they need 100 more for the next day, and then 100 more. And every shipment they get is slightly different than the shipment before that here. I want to ask you a question related to that, because we're talking about Golden Dome, at least we were at the beginning. How adaptive are the Americans? They've got more money to throw around, but you've served with them down at NORAD, I'm sure in other postings. I get the feeling that the Pentagon ain't nimble.
So there's a few fundamental differences between Canadian acquisition and American acquisition. The fundamental thing is that relationship with especially the large companies, the five biggies in the United States, where they are paid to develop technology and R&D for the Department of Defense, and they do so very, very. And so instead of trying to get everybody to do an RFPs where here, give us a bid and we'll see if we want that, or we go out and say this is what we want. They're developing and they're paid to develop pointy edge technologies, for the Department of Defense. One, two, each one of the services has innovation centers that is testing and trialing the most adaptive and forward-thinking technologies, and they're putting them into semi-operational constructs to see whether they work, and then going back to these companies and saying, okay, pull that forward, that back. So they're a little bit more adaptive to us in that sphere. However, the division between the combatant commanders and the services provides a real fundamental problem, because all of the money and the innovation and the technological advances and the acquisition is on the services side, whereas the people that are cold-faced facing the adversary at any one point in time are the combatant commanders. Now, they break that mold, and for most of the listeners, this might seem to be US speak, whatever, but stick with me for a second. Let's go to China. The American commander that's facing China is the commander of US Indo-PACOM, US Indo-Pacific Command. He's a four-star general that lives in Hawaii and everything. He commands thousands of forces in Korea, in Japan, in Hawaii, at Guam, Diego Garcia, and across the eastern seaboard that are focused on countering the threat that China poses, especially to Taiwan, but other allies. But he doesn't procure anything. He doesn't have the money to procure. That's not his job. So let's just talk about aircraft. His Air Force commander is another four-star American USA, but that Air Force commander is dual-hatted. Yes, he's the air component commander for US Indo-PACOM, but he's the commander of Pacific Air Forces for the Commander of the United States Air Force. So in one hat, he's trying to defend against China, and the next minute he's picking up the phone and calling the commander of the Air Force, I need this, like this. This is how my future needs to look like. These are the systems that we need, and these are the threats that need. So they marry those two things. This is the real problematic part, because they can advocate in different ways. The combatant commander works for the Secretary of Defense, which would be the equivalent to our Minister of National Defense. The services work for the Joint Chiefs. So they're playing through the Pentagon, but the combatant commanders are end running this. So it provides fun within the Pentagon. Everything in the United States military is politicized. So that's what slows things down, to your point. But here's where things change. Everybody in the United States, and this is fundamentally different in Canada as to the United States, and I've had to give testimony, and I've had to speak to senators and make the cases. They get worldwide international relations. They get the need for securing the world and securing themselves. I think they've been focused on the away game as opposed to the continent, and this is where they're slow to maneuver. But you don't have to explain to a U.S. congressman why it's important to invest in defense. When you're going to do the same thing in Canadian speak, you're walking and saying, and the question I've had to answer that frustrates me more than anything else is, why would we want to spend money on this versus healthcare? You never, ever, ever have to make that case in the United States. You just don't. Why would a military leader have to tell you, look, I face these threats every day. You want me to categorize between, I don't know, the preparation for the next pandemic versus the threat that's posed right now from Russia with hypersonic glide vehicles or whatever that threat is? I'm not in a position to be able to do that, but you never have to have that conversation there. We have this conversation routinely in Canada.
It's like I was saying before, it's like our reality-free existence. It's like, why, honestly, Scott, like, even just as a journalist who writes about defense issues, I cannot tell you how many times I've had some variation on why do we even need a military? We're a peaceful country. We're peacekeepers. The Americans will protect us. Why do we even need a military? And I don't know. I don't really know how to
state. 51st state, right? Like your sovereignty, your ability to respect rule of law, your ability to have an independent thought and rights that you believe are the way that you should be able to express them, that these things will not be denigrated or reduced over time. These are the things of sovereignty. And so if Canadians didn't get a wake-up call with the 51st state thing, they should, when you watch, yes, I understand the Supreme Court issued that order. I'm not going to follow it, or I don't think I have to follow it because I'm the executive order. And imagine if the Supreme Court of Canada said you will, just as a matter, you will respect the rights of all Indigenous populations in all affairs, economic and social and otherwise. And the Prime Minister said, I don't think I'm bound by that.
Nah.
I'll just go off and do what I want. I'm going to deport people to these things. The sovereignty is our ability to say, no, this is the Canadian way of speaking. So for me, I would much rather live in that apathy than descend into where that, American, I'm not trying to say that they're better in any way, shape, or form, but I will say that the naive nature that most Canadians live, that you articulated very, very well, this might be problematic for us in the future. So for example, getting back to Golden Dome, when I was the director of operations for NORAD, I remember being part of a conference and sitting on a panel talking about why Canada should be involved in ballistic missile defense. And 3 academics just kind of poo-pooed it. Well, what are you talking about? You don't want defensive systems. That strikes at the concept of mutual assured destruction. And I went, how passe and archaic is a punishment-based deterrent system as mutual assured destruction when you can't consider the panoply of threats that exist out there and be able to react on any of them? Because the fundamental nature of any deterrent is you have to create the idea in the mind of the adversary that they're not going to attack. But if they think they can achieve their objectives, they're going to do so. So your deterrent doesn't work. And the nuclear backstop, when you listen to Americans, they're not going to do that because we nuke them. And you're going, I don't believe that you'll end civilization because somebody attacked Canada, right? And this kind of, so here, I'm going to give you an analogy, and I've spoken about this. It's a very popular idea, but it's one that kind of brings deterrence and attacks and the current system back to, I question Canada's participation in NATO. And I question Canada's continued participation in NATO, not because it's not a good alliance, not because I don't believe in our allies, but as a NORAD guy who defends this continent, and where I find that our continent is woefully underprotected, whereas Europe is very protected, especially with the constrained geography that they have as compared to the expansive North America. What if Russia attacked Canada and the United States conventionally? We stayed below the nuclear threshold, but at the same time, Putin said to all the NATO allies, I bear you no ill will. We are Europeans. I will never cross across those borders. I have no designs on Europe. It's those Westerners in North America that I want. What would be the first phone call that happened after Article 5 was invoked? What would be the first phone call from NATO? It would be a call for even more troops from the Canadian Armed Forces to deploy to Europe. There are no plans for any Europeans to come to North America and come to our assistance. Mm-hmm. Secondly, do you think that Finland, Sweden, the UK, Germany, France are going to roll their tanks, Poland, going to roll their tanks across those borders and attack Russia? Do you think their bombers are going to come out and start attacking Russian cities and capabilities? No. So, what is it that NATO is actually giving us in terms of a deterrent? Us. So if Canada is going to participate with, I don't know, a couple of thousand folks in Latvia, why again? So that they won't attack us in Canada? I could make the case that if you're going to contribute significant forces, money from agents, maybe you should think about NORAD and continental defense first, right? We always said, and you and I know this, all Canadian defense policy contains two imperatives and one choice. You must defend Canada. You must defend North America. Everything else is a choice. Yeah. Contribute to international peace and security, remain engaged in the world, which is the SSE, for the current defense policy. But you have to do those two first things. And we're not doing these first. We put the priority on the away game, even now. So in that analogy, when I look at, the apathy that Canadians have, this is why I think they have to wake up really fast.
It was very interesting a few months ago when the annexationist rhetoric was at its absolute maximum to see who spoke up and who didn't. And one of those lists was a lot longer than the other. And that is something I certainly noticed. And it didn't shock me. Europe has a long history of viewing alliances as things that exist for Europe's benefit. And I'm okay with that. But I would just like Canada to have an equally blunt understanding of its own place in the world and who our friends are and what our interests are. I want to ask you about what our interests are. If Golden Dome goes ahead, what does Canada do? And assuming we get into it, what is going to be the ask of Canada and what would we expect to get back for it? What would Golden Dome look like in the Canadian context? I'm imagining the Americans would want radar and sensor bases operated either by Americans or Canadians. I don't think it matters necessarily, but they would need visibility over our airspace and beyond. What would we want back in terms of defenses for our cities and industries and critical infrastructure?
That's a great question. So I see the Golden Dome as just being adding to the mission of NORAD. Like I just do. I don't see the two things, people have said, well, now NORAD, future Golden Dome. No, future NORAD, which by the way, is the architecture upon which, you operate the Golden Dome. To be clear, and I hope our readers hear this, NORTHCOM, US NORTHCOM, which is the Global Combatant Command American that, controls and conducts operations to defend the American piece and just the uniquely American piece, which includes the ballistic missile defense capability currently, is the same command as NORAD. It's the same staff, except for a Canadian 2-star J3. All the rest of the staff are the same. And the command center that runs both the American US NORTHCOM and NORAD is the same command center. And it's there for a reason, right? So to me, Golden Dome would be adding to this. Okay, to your ask. We already share the information about all of our airspace, right? The external threats as well as the internal pieces. NAV Canada and the FAA share pictures back and forth, and they share all of that with NORAD, especially since 9/11, for the internal picture. The external picture, based upon the radars that exist in Canada, whether it's the North Warning System or the long-range radar systems that are in Alaska, all of that is shared picture. It would be more of the same. The ask then, therefore, becomes Canada to begin to procure and to develop systems in concert with the United States that would develop more of that domain awareness and then more of the defeat capability that allows them to counter that threat. So, for example, a first example of this was Canada announced that it's going to procure the over-the-horizon radar, OTHR, from Australia, and it's going to deploy it. And it's going to be a Canadian system. My expectation, that Canadian system would plug into NORAD and would provide the capability, because that's what it's supposed to do, to bounce off the ionosphere and see into the Arctic spaces, because our long-range radars are limited by the curvature of the Earth, which means that you got them along just south of the archipelago. They can't even see to the extent of our archipelago to see what's up there because of the slant of the Earth. These would be able to provide that domain awareness. Each system that you layer in, whether it's a short-range system for target acquisition or a long-range system from a surveillance point of view or a space-based system, you would plug into the NORAD architecture to enable them to be NORAD, which is both nations, to be able to better characterize, so describe the threats, and then be able to counter them. So then the next ask is going to be develop defensive suites that start to begin to protect the golden bubbles. I like your analogy. We should use this live, right? We'll write a meme and it'll go viral. Those golden bubbles will begin to contribute immediately to deterrence. So deterrence, there's two fundamental elements of deterrence, right? You can either be a punish-based system, mutually assured destruction, or we'll schwack you if you schwack us. That's a punishment-based deterrence system. There's a denial-based, theory on deterrence as well, which is if I can deny you the achievement of your objectives, you cannot bring down the U.S. economy. You cannot bring down the Canadian and U.S. architecture, either militarily or politically or economically. You can't, because we're protecting those key points. And the more that you develop those, then you wouldn't attack in the first place, because you know you can never achieve that objective. Now, that assumes a rational actor, but to a certain extent, what I've seen of Vladimir Putin is he is a rational actor. You might not like the rationale that he uses, but Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine, you can draw some direct parallels and lines there, even with the activities on the weekend, as to what he's trying to do to reassert the preeminence of peace, but it will be peace on Russia's terms, how Russia sees it, and he's not going to listen to anybody else in the world. And the global South tends to agree with him, by the way. So that's how you do it, and that's what I think the ask is going to be for Canada.
One more question for you, and then we can wrap this up. But just a comment I'll make in reply is, if about a year ago, when the Iranians hit Israel with everything they could muster and the Israelis shrugged it off, that's a kind of deterrence too. Because
this is it. So think of this fight as being a fight with a bully. It's easy to imagine because it's Vladimir Putin. Well, at one point in time, if you don't have the ability to block punches, then you're just going to sit there and take it. He's going to hit you. Note I didn't say hit back. I just said block his punches or make his punches not important. And so there's two elements to this. And when I was the director of operations for NORAD, we looked at this, very clearly, is that you're going to develop two things at the same time. And the first one is going to be the ability to knock those missiles, cruise missiles, drones, aircraft, whatever it is, ballistic missiles to a certain extent, because you got to be careful not to impact that nuclear backstop, right? You still want to have that ability out there, but especially cruise missiles, because they're the conventional end of that realm. If you can knock those things down, that's the first thing. And then the second thing is you have to create resilience within your, and this also applies to the IT and cyber related things across all of your architecture, which supports not just the military response, but the civilian ability to recuperate from those responses. You have to have a public safety system through DHS in the United States, through public safety in Canada, that enables a resilient population, a resilient economy, a resilient, political sphere, so that they can respond in crisis. If you do those two things, you start denying in the idea of the adversary that they can ever achieve their objectives, and that's real deterrence in my mind.
Uh-oh. All those things you're talking about, we don't have right now.
Here we go, right?
Yeah. All right, last question for you. And I have done my best to avoid talking politics beyond where it was strictly necessary for discussions of procurement and whatnot. There's a question right now about how close to the Americans we want to be. There's also the reality of how close to the Americans we need to be, or if I can be even blunter, how close to the Americans we are. They are, looking out my window right now, they're that away. They're not that far. How do we balance the imperatives of Canadian sovereignty, particularly in an era of what looks to be increasing American isolation, but also increasing American great power and position, more 19th century than 20th? How do we, as the smaller power, interface with them in a way that is respectful of their needs, but also protects our needs? If you've got any easy answers to this, I think they need to hear them in Ottawa.
Yeah. So no, there are no easy answers, but I think that Prime Minister Carney and the current Canadian administration are doing the right things. So first, independent economic supply chains and a diversified, not just complete reliance on the United States is probably the best path, but it has to be a long-term path. That includes the ability to trade more with more versatility across Canada than with anybody else. You have to be strong at home first. Now, I would carry that strong at home, elbows up kind of mentality into the defense and security sphere. You want to be a strong partner. It has been decades that myself and people like me have been advocating for us to be stronger and stronger in defense, because our allies more and more are saying, as individual soldiers and officers, and you guys are on par with the best, but your defense capabilities, we really don't want you to come to the party because you dumb down the whole thing and you make it really difficult for us to integrate with your old aircraft and your old systems and and we just wish there was more of you. So when you do these little things and you think it's a big thing and we make a big deal of it, it's not. It's more of and it's becoming more of a problem than anything else. The F-18 is a classic example of that. It's becoming more of a problem in the battle space than it is a help. Right? It's not, and so that's a problem for Canada, and you have to solve that first. And the way which you do this, again, I'll go to the announcement of OTHR. We're going to procure OTHR. We're going to set it up. It's going to be a Canadian system. We're going to run it. We don't need you, but we're offering this because as part of NORAD, that's the shared picture that we would do. By the way, we're going to procure this defensive system, regard this thing at let's say the 3:00 in Halifax. And by doing that, we contribute to your defense. And by doing this, then you're an equal partner. Look, if this is always going to be a bit of a, the million men under arms versus men and women, versus us. Oh, okay. But there's also an element of, here in the Arctic at this point, if that attack happens, it's going to be all Canadian. And you're going, oh. So you want to grow into that as much as you possibly can to be that peer. On the military side, they consider us peers, not from a capability point of view, but person to person, they consider us peers. When I was in Alaska as the deputy commander of the Alaska NORAD region, my boss had forces from Alaska all the way through Hawaii out to Guam and Diego Garcia. He was gone very, very often. And even when he was visiting troops in Alaska, he was out of contact. So I had to be holding the bag. There was no, wow, okay, there's a big thing. The Canadians in charge. No, the Canadians in charge whenever the boss is out of pocket. And this is the same in Colorado Springs. It's the same everywhere. We are absolutely trusted at a core, visceral level by their military. We have to step up. And the more that we do, the more that you're going to play that balance. And then my last thing is take out the emotions. Now, this is going to be hard for us. Most of us have been using the word betrayal ever since that 51st state thing. And even among some of our people that we considered friends, we either heard silence or we heard, no, he's a bit of a goof. He didn't mean that, to sort of thing. But you'd be better off anyways. And that's when you go, oh crap, that this really is, you really do think you're better than us in all those ways. That's not a conversation. That might be fun during hockey games and things like that. It's not a conversation on a political diplomatic realm that is going to be any beneficial. Prime Minister Carney's dealing very transactionally with this president. He does not believe in friendship or understand friendship the way that you and I do. He thinks that the role between ally and adversary is amorphous, much like in the business sphere. I might hack on you one day, but then I'll do a business deal with you the next. And that's not how international affairs and military operations are conducted. So you're going to want to deal very transactionally with that until you have a more stable a more stable and long-term view with respect to how that adversary and ally relationship is going to play out.
I hope we get that back. I'm not convinced we do, but all we can do is play for time and see what happens in about 3.5 years. Scott, a pleasure. I wish it was more uplifting, but lots of important stuff to talk about. I've been thinking about you since last week when all this Golden Dome stuff started to come up, because you and I have been talking about the need for better Canadian air defense in particular for years. And I know that 41 million of our buddies would look at us like we were weirdos when we talked about it, but I'm hoping people are paying more attention. I'm hoping people are realizing why this stuff matters. And if not, they will have no one to blame but themselves, because we did our best.
Exactly. So well done to you. And I always love these conversations. It's
me as well.
It's very enlightening for me, and I always learn a lot.
Well, it makes me feel less crazy and alone. So thank you for joining me today. Scott Clancy, my guest, retired Major General, Royal Canadian Air Force, Director of Operations at NORAD, formerly, of course, and today a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. You know, it's funny, guys. When I started recording this episode of On the Line, I didn't realize there was going to be a through line of Canada having to assert itself. I thought I had a cybersecurity interview, a royal visit interview, and a military interview. And the military interview I thought would be more kind of elbows up in how Canada is asserting itself. But Canada needing to take itself seriously was something that really began to come through in all three segments. So there you go, an accidental theme. Stick around for the next episode. On the Line will be back in a week. The Line podcast, of course, will be out as usual on Friday. If you like any of what you've seen here today, go to readtheline.ca, like and subscribe, and we will be back with you soon with more great podcasts. Take good care.